Hey there, and welcome to the Transparently Jordan podcast, where I'll be talking with a new guest each week, and we'll be covering topics in health, fitness, lifestyle, and so much more. So stick around and let's get into today's episode.
This is Radiant Voices Media.
And if anyone's ever experiencing anxiety or any kind of mental health issues, we look at, well, what's the gut doing? Because is it inflamed? Do you not have the ability to extract nutrients from your food? Because you can be eating 100% organic, grass-fed, like amazing quality food, but if you're not breaking it down properly and it's not going to where it needs to be, then there's almost no point. You know, they used to say you are what you eat, but more recently it's actually you are what you absorb, because you can eat well but not absorb it well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome to another episode. In today's episode, I am talking with Stephanie, who is a clinical naturopath and herbalist. She is from Eclipse Naturopath here in Adelaide. We are going to be discussing the gut. We are going to be discussing gut health, poor gut health, nutrition, and lifestyle factors that affect the gut, probiotics, common gut issues, remedies, etc., etc. This one is jam-packed with some interesting information and some tips and tricks for all of you listeners. I have been wanting to do a dedicated episode to the gut for a long time. The gut is, of course, so prevalent these days. There is so much more and more information coming out about the gut, and I think with the foods that we're eating these days, it's more common for more and more people to have these sensitive guts. So I thought it would be interesting to, again, dedicate a full episode. I know I've briefly touched on the gut in previous episodes. There's been a couple, actually. Yeah, I don't really have much else to add. I did my first triathlon the other week, and I almost drowned in the open water swim. It was intense. I was so proud to finish, and the fire's burning. There is another one that I have signed up for, and I'm going to be doing at the end of the year, and then half Ironman next year. Of course, the goal is a full Ironman, but it really lit a fire with me. I didn't realize how much or how crazy it would be in the water with just people all around kicking, accidentally hitting you. 300 meters in, just started to panic, and it really affected my swim. But like I was saying, finished it, on to the next one now, joining a group just to help with the swim. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the future. Other than that, it's been pretty typical with me. Just train, eat, sleep, work, repeat. But I love it and might as well do it while I still can and while I love it and enjoy it. Now, let's get into today's episode. Again, it is jam-packed. There is lots to go over. So yeah, tune on in. But welcome to the podcast. Again, thanks for coming on and spending the time. And, I'm always very appreciative to people like yourself who have taken the time to come on. Morning was okay, was it?
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Down at the beach.
Yes, I
Yeah.
know. That's what you're saying. That's good. And it's a good day for that. But Stephanie, tell us a little bit about yourself and all of the listeners.
So I am a yoga teacher and I own a yoga studio. And more recently, in the last 3 years, I've also become a naturopath as well. I have a puppy. I feel like that's what's taking up most of my life currently. It's become a bit of a personality. But yeah, I love the beach. I pretty much go to the beach every single day, and that's what I like to do in my spare time.
Yeah. Well, of course, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the podcast is because I know the gut is, and we were just talking about this, the gut is so humongous these days. And I think there's more and more information coming out on the gut and gut health. And I've touched on the gut a few times with previous guests, but I haven't had like a dedicated episode to it. So I'm interested to kind of pick your brain on the gut and kind of go from there. But maybe to the listeners, in your experience, what do people come in to see you with regarding the gut, or what kind of clientele do you try and tailor your services to with gut health and those type of things?
So I would say that I've never really had a client that's come in that hasn't had a gut related issue, but that's not always what they come in at the start for. So they might come in for like hormone issues or like something to do with mental health. And then we end up uncovering through the questioning that they have gut issues, but they didn't even realize it was a thing. So I would say when people are aware of it, the most common symptom is bloating. That seems to be like, really prevalent. And then the other one would be like inconsistent bowel motions. So people who, might not be going to the toilet every single day, but they're like, but that's normal for me. I've never done that since I was a child. So it's like, okay, but so that's common, but it's not normal, like. So I think there's a lot of that where like people just maybe aren't aware of their gut issues. But yeah, I would say bloating would be number one because it's more obvious, like physically you can see it, whereas other gut issues can be a little bit not so obvious.
What are kind of those non-obvious ones? What are some ones that you typically pick out from people?
So as the gut is just so broad. So as we know that gut issues don't just stay in the gut, they are like related to other systems of the body. So when I'm looking for gut issues, sometimes it's not symptom wise, it's more I'm looking at conditions that people might have. So if someone has like an autoimmune condition or they have eczema, or they have like issues regulating their mood, issues with their cycle, those kinds of things. And then they might just have really kind of like low grade. So it might just be like, oh yeah, every like couple of days or once a week or something, I might get like really loose stools, or I have urgency where I need to run to the toilet, but doesn't everyone? Or again, like not going to the bathroom regularly. White coating on the tongue is like a pretty common physical sign that you can see that someone has gut issues, if they're craving sugar quite a bit, or sometimes it's just people who are like really tired all of the time. Yeah, I think that's most of
Right.
the, yeah.
And are those the questions that you normally ask? Like you were saying that you normally people come and see you for other issues, and you kind of get the gut out of some questioning. Are those common questions that you ask and you get those answers?
Yeah, we pretty much go through like, how many times a day do you go to the toilet? What's the consistency like? What's the color like? For some people, it is really uncomfortable and you can tell that they're sort of like recoiling because they're like, well, I didn't come here for that. But like I said, I don't feel like you can really treat a lot of conditions without treating the gut. So usually because it's such a comprehensive questioning process when you see a naturopath, the first appointment goes for 75 minutes. So we're going through like multiple systems. So I'll first identify like, okay, what's the main thing that they're coming in for? And then what are the other contributing factors? And that usually leads me to the gut. Like I said, I've never treated someone and not done anything with the gut. And I've never done a gut test with someone and gotten like perfect results, even people who don't have any symptoms at all. Usually there'll be signs of like, no, I think this is still a contributing factor, even though you're not getting obvious digestive symptoms. So that can be really interesting to know is a lot of people think, well, I'm relatively like fine in that area. I don't have many issues. But then, like I was saying, they have the eczema, they have skin issues, they have other issues that you're like, well, I still feel like this is a gut issue because everything starts in the gut. And that's what we have known for like thousands of years, like Hippocrates, which was the father of medicine, he even said everything begins in the gut. So I think we're just starting to slowly come back to that, especially now with the advancements of like functional testing and things where you can actually see physically, well, there are imbalances here. It's becoming a lot more obvious that like a lot of people are struggling with that.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think more and more people are talking about the gut. And, I think also with social media, you flick through and everybody seems to be discussing like this for gut, that for gut. And it's such a prevalent thing these days. But maybe for listeners, because I think like we all talk about gut and we talk about gut health, but not a lot of us know exactly what is entailed in the gut and what kind of it all encompasses. So, do you mind maybe giving a brief description of kind of what the gut is and the importance of it with us?
Yeah, so the gut is kind of just a general term for like the gastrointestinal system, which governs a couple of different organs. Like you've got the stomach, the small intestines, the large intestines, and the liver kind of comes under the digestive as well. And it basically functions to, like break down food and properly distribute nutrients through the body. That's how we get like all of the nutrients and extract it from food. And then what people might not know is that the digestive system does so much more than just what happens within, like the stomach, because we've got functions like so when it comes to the nervous system, we've got the gut-brain axis, which is basically the gut and the brain communicating in a two-way back and forth. And so with that, obviously when the stomach is upset, the brain is going to be upset. So if we've got inflammation in the gut, we get brain inflammation. And a lot of people find that to be a scary term. But brain inflammation is just anxiety and depression. So at its core, that's what anxiety and depression stem from. So the gut actually produces like 80% of our serotonin as well, which is a neurotransmitter. So the gut is also responsible for sending signals and, like communication to the brain as well. So that's kind of one of its most important functions, which is why I mentioned if anyone's ever experiencing anxiety or any kind of mental health issues, we look at, well, what's the gut doing? Because is it inflamed? Do you not have the ability to extract nutrients from your food? Because you can be eating 100% organic, grass-fed, like amazing quality food, but if you're not breaking it down properly and it's not going to where it needs to be, then there's almost no point. They used to say you are what you eat, but more recently it's actually you are what you absorb, because you can eat well but not absorb it well.
Right, right. And that I guess is important, like you were saying, because in these days too, another thing, especially in like from the health and fitness space where I am, like a lot of people are eating the grass-fed stuff and are eating all of these expensive, high-quality foods, but if they can't absorb it, then that's probably detrimental to I guess their goals. But I guess what are some, because you've already touched on a bunch of them, but what are some causes of poor gut health that people kind of come and see you for, or that you find usually often? I know briefly, like before we started, you touched that you get a lot of the fitness space people and they're eating these certain ways, but is that common that you see, like eating lots of protein or eating this, and then could those be causes of poor gut health, or?
Definitely in some foods. I wouldn't say protein because, again, that's kind of more of like a natural food source. It's like a whole foods. Generally, that's okay. It's more when we get to like the low calorie products. So, I saw a really interesting quote yesterday and it said 90 chemicals. They cover that by saying 30 calories. But what they're really saying is there's 90 different chemicals in here because it's not food. It's chemically structured to look like food, but it's no longer food. So, it happens a lot with like the protein bars, the protein powders, the sugar-free drinks and sauces and all of those kinds of things. You have to think if something says no sugar and it tastes sweet, what is it that's sweetening it? And that's when people have to be a little bit more discerning about, you can't just look at like what's on the front of the product, or you can't just follow the health star rating. I actually teach people to really read the ingredients, and I'm like, okay, if there's more than 20 ingredients, that's already a red flag. More than 15, probably a red flag. We have to be looking for things like sugar alcohols because that's really common in, like the low calorie products. And that contributes a lot to, there's a specific gut condition called SIBO, so small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. And it's basically where like there's kind of a blockage and the food's not going down to the large intestine. It's staying in the small intestine and fermenting, and that causes an overgrowth of bacteria that causes like gas and bloating. And I find it really, because it gets worse when you're eating sugar alcohol. So that's one of the triggers for it. Sometimes it is people who they're like, I'm eating really well, I'm sticking to my calories. I'm mostly eating like meat and veg kind of thing. But then you're looking at like, okay, what are you snacking on and what kind of drinks? And they're like, oh yeah, I have a Pepsi Max every night with dinner. And it's those sort of things where, yeah, like that can definitely be a cause. But then there's so many other causes as well. Like it is really broad because sometimes we're not just looking at like, what have you done in the last 6 months? We're looking at like, well, how were you born? You know, like were you a vaginal birth or were you C-section? Because that will affect the gut microbiome that you're born with. Were you breastfed? Because you get a different type of diversity when you're breastfed as a baby. We're looking, you know, did you have like colic or were you unsettled as a baby? Because those are all signs that those gut issues actually started quite early. You know, did you have recurring tonsillitis, which can be actually a hidden dairy intolerance? So there's like so many things that we can look at in terms of like, what have you done in your lifestyle? Have you taken a lot of antibiotics throughout your life? Because we know that that completely degrades the gut bacteria and the gut wall lining. You know, have you had even like the impacts of trauma? You know, have you been through like really stressful times in your life? Do you smoke? Do you drink alcohol? Like all of those factors, not just one of them will cause gut issues, but when you've had a lifetime of like 20, 30, 40 years of doing multiple things that are not supportive of your gut health, then your body will get to a point where it starts to communicate like, hey, I actually can't take this load anymore and I need some support. And that's when the symptoms start to come up.
Right. So where do people start? Because, you have those people and they have all of these factors that people don't think about, I think, those factors like how you were born and then, the alcohol. I mean, alcohol is probably not good regardless, but you have like these 30, 40 factors. Where do people, when they want to start, I guess, focusing better on their gut, when they want to turn things around, start feeling better, what are some tips and tricks of what people need to start looking at, really?
Yeah, so there are a lot of like basics that people can start with just doing themselves. So, one thing that I think is really underrated is spending time in nature because there's actually multiple studies that touching dirt and like being in nature can diversify your gut microbiome because we're getting that touch point with different bacterias. You know, how they say like with kids, let them play outside because we're just like sterilized now. We're inside, we're constantly washing our hands, we're using, hand sanitizer. So yeah, spending time in nature, just doing the basics like getting enough sleep, seeing sunlight in the morning, eating whole foods. It's such an easy principle because like eating well is actually not hard. It's like just eat real food. Cut out the packaged stuff as much as you can. Of course, there's a time and a place for packaged foods. And this is not to say that everyone's diet has to be perfect, right? But if you're eating these things at least once a day, multiple times a day, then you do really miss a lot of the good quality nutrients because again, you're just getting calories, but you're not getting like actual nutrients that your body can use. So those are probably the basics I would start with. Like make sure you drink plenty of water, just kind of optimizing your lifestyle. And then if you're doing those things, if you're eating good food, and also something I forgot to mention is like eating slowly. Something that I think is a really common contributor to a lot of gut issues is people, they get home from work, they're rushing around, they're still in that rush state, and then they sit down. And all of a sudden their body's supposed to go into rest and digest, but they haven't done anything to help it get that way. So your body's still feeling stressed. And when it feels stressed, it shuts down digestive function because it's like, well, that's not essential when we're stressed. We're not going to be eating anytime. And suddenly you're putting food into your stomach. You're not chewing it well because you're watching TV or you're on your phone or you're talking to your partner. And before you know it, you've eaten your whole meal and it's just kind of sitting in your stomach because digestion also starts in the mouth. So if you're not chewing your food enough, all of the enzymes that we need don't start in the mouth. And by the time it gets down, to the large intestine, it's like hasn't had time to really like break down enough. So that's when people can feel quite like heavy after eating. So yeah, there's lots of good basics to start with, but I feel like if you're doing the basics and you're still not improving, then that's where you might need like tailored support because this is something I rant about on Instagram all the time, but one of my least favorite things are practitioners, whether they're qualified or not, we have a bit of both, who offer this like one fit all solution. So you'll look up, do I have a parasite? This is really hard because sometimes people come to me and they're like, I think I have a parasite. And I'm like, no, I think you just potentially have some like dysfunction in your gut, but it's not always a parasite because we'll do the test and we'll get lots out of the test, but there's no parasite. And of course there are some tests which we can get into, like there's some gut tests which like aren't that great and you can still have a parasite or have some kind of bacterial overgrowth, but it just won't find it because it's not a good diagnostic tool. But yes, I do only very good quality gut testing, and we do that, and it's not a parasite. And they're like, oh, that's why the parasite cleanse that I did online didn't work, So you go online and you're like, I have gut health issues. You look it up and someone's convinced you that you have a parasite because it must be. That's the only
I've thought that
thing.
so many
Yeah.
times.
Don't worry, I have too. I went to India and I came back and I was like, something is not right.
Yeah.
But there was just so much else going on, and doesn't always have to be a parasite. So people will put themselves in this like parasite cleanse. And what, I recently had a friend who did it. She is very much into the health and fitness, industry. And she was like, oh, well, my coach suggested that I could have a parasite. So I went and did this parasite cleanse. The problem is she's taking these really strong, we call them like anti-parasitic or antimicrobial herbs, which basically go into the gut. And some of them are not selective. So they can act like an antibiotic in terms of they will wipe out most things, including the beneficial bacteria, but not as much as antibiotics. But even if you have a parasite, you need to know which one. You can't just go and wipe out everything in your gut. So she's taken this, it's really strong, but she doesn't go to the toilet every day. So she's basically like stirring up all of these toxins by killing off something that could be in her gut, but then they're not escaping. So the toxins are just like recirculating, and her gut issues actually got worse after that parasite cleanse. So that's why it is a very tricky thing. Like even on my Instagram, I'm never one to say, these are the good herbs to take if you've got this, or this is a good supplement to take if you've got that, because I just think it's really not that simple. Like sometimes I get DMs and people say, oh, I've just started taking this product because I heard it was good and it's good. And I say, but what for? Like it can be good, but it depends what you're taking it for. There's no such thing as like a general like gut health product. Same as like probiotics. People self-prescribe probiotics all the time. But if you don't know what strains of probiotics you actually need, you can end up doing more damage, because even with beneficial bacteria, you can actually have too much of one species and that will still contribute to the imbalance. So again, sometimes people take probiotics and they're like, I actually feel worse after that. And it's like, yeah, no wonder, because it's not specific.
Yeah, I've done that numerous times. And I think a lot of people, like you were saying, do that. And I think that like many professions, like that's why you want to see somebody who is educated in that, because it isn't a one fits all approach. And I think a lot of the times when we're on, like a lot of people want the easy route, and I understand that we're all busy, but when you scroll through social media, people sell their like one fits all approach, and that's very difficult in helping somebody because everybody's individualized, I guess. But going back to like you were saying that going back and like touching the earth and whatnot, that just made me think like since I guess when 2022 ended, like COVID, we started washing our hands more frequently and we started being a lot cleaner. Like have you noticed that you have more clientele these days versus like pre that in the whole naturopath space, because like we are a little bit more cleaner and we're not getting those bacteria? Is that kind of a contributing factor to people's
It
gut?
definitely could be, but I think because it's been such a short period, it's quite hard to know. And I think because I only really started practicing right after COVID,
That's fair.
it's kind of hard to know, and distinguish the difference. But definitely I've noticed like immune issues are like at an all-time high. Like people have such low immunity since COVID. And one of those reasons is because COVID, as any virus, can negatively impact the gut bacteria. So a lot of people were getting COVID and one of their first symptoms was they thought they had food poisoning because it was like gut-related symptoms. But going to the immune system also, what people don't know is 70 to 80% of the immune system lives in the gut. So if you're getting sick really often, it could be that like, yes, you're over sanitizing and you're like basically stripping like all of the natural bacteria from your skin. But also there could be like other things going on. And I think again, like saying, it's a pile on. It's just like multiple things that happen over the years that contribute to those things.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because it's an interesting thing because I think like we never used to be as clean as we are, and that probably sounds a bit disgusting, but I assume like it can affect people's immune system. I don't know the research around that, but it is an interesting topic. But you already mentioned some signs of the unhealthy gut, like bloating, for example. And I think bloating's such an interesting thing because so many people, myself included, have experienced bloating. Um, Is that, would you say, the most common kind of sign of an unhealthy gut is bloating? And what are some tips, like some easy tips that you often give to clients who experience bloating? Because it's probably a loaded question because bloating can happen
Mhm.
from a lot of different, but what are some common reasons, the most common reasons people bloat, I guess?
So bloating's not always, I guess, like unnatural. There's the normal bloating that occurs if you just eat too much food, and that can be quite normal because it sort of self-resolves. The bloating that we're more concerned about is the one that you wake up with. So some people are waking up bloated. That's already a sign that, like, okay, well, you haven't eaten anything. Your gut should have reset overnight. Or the bloating that gets worse as the day goes on. So like the more food you eat, and it can be quite like solid and like harder to touch as opposed to softer. So that can sometimes be like excess gas buildup from things like drinking too many fizzy drinks. Chewing gum is also a really common contributor to bloating. I think I mentioned before eating too fast as well. So that's just like, again, the simple stuff you can start with is like focus on just like water and herbal tea intake. Something like peppermint is really good if you are getting bloated because it's a digestive. Chamomile can also be really good as well. Again, just stripping it back to like whole foods, drinks that are like natural, and slow down your eating, eat mindfully, try and take 5 deep breaths before you eat. So you sit down, you're about to eat your meal, and you're almost like preparing your body with that deep breath to go into rest and digest so that your body can take up the food. And eating bitters with your food is also a really good way to increase digestive enzymes and stomach acid. So we're thinking things like dressing your salad with apple cider vinegar or having some apple cider vinegar in warm water before your meal, especially before like iron-rich meals, so like red meat, because it is typically like a thicker fiber to break down. And some people, I have people who say, oh, I don't eat red meat because I feel like it doesn't sit right with me. And it's like, well, that means you have like issues with your stomach acid and digestive enzymes. So that would be a really good place to start, is looking around the environment that you're eating and the kinds of foods that you're eating. And also if you find that it gets worse when you're stressed, that's a really common link, working on your nervous system.
Okay. All right. So those people, like you gave the example of the red meat. So those people that, are sensitive, let's say, to red meats or these type of foods, do you often recommend people that they just don't eat those foods? Are there any foods that you typically recommend to avoid, or are there ways like the apple cider vinegar to help, I guess, increase people's abilities to eat those foods that they're sensitive to?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm looking at that because I'm not someone who's going to say just don't eat that food. I
Mm,
think when we start doing that, we lose the ability to eat really like nutrient and vitamin rich food. Like I feel like for me, red meat personally is such an important part of people's diets. And of course, I'll work with people who are vegetarian, but knowing that that is a limitation, is that you're not getting those same vitamins, and plant food is just digest differently than meat as well. Um, but there's definitely ways that we can increase the capacity. So again, we look at like, okay, is it a stomach acid and digestive enzyme issue? Or is it something else within the gut? Because there's certain bacteria that will feed off red meat as well. So that's where testing can become really important, because if you've got too much of a certain type of bacteria that basically thrives off red meat, then that bacteria continues to grow the more you eat red meat. That would be the only case where I might say if someone's eating it like multiple times a week, maybe 4 or 5 times, then we might just cut it back a little bit, but we never avoid. I'm very much like, let's add in more different foods rather than trying to like avoid things.
mm.
Of course, the probably common foods that we would normally cut out for a short period of time would be like gluten or dairy, depending. Again, don't self-prescribe yourself that
Okay.
diet because it's not sustainable. Like if the only way that you can keep your gut issues under control is by avoiding like a long list of foods, that's already a problem. I've had
Mm.
clients who have been told they just have to stay on a low FODMAP diet for the rest of their lives. I don't know if you know much about the low
Nah,
FODMAP,
nah.
but
Tell
it
us about that.
basically cuts out like so many food groups and so
Ah,
much food, like even like fruits,
ah.
vegetables, like lots of everything, like garlic, onion, like all of those kinds of things, which are actually act as like prebiotics to feed our guts. So we
Mm.
still need them. So imagine, I've had a client before who's been on a low FODMAP diet for 20 years because she was diagnosed with IBS about 30 years ago,
Right.
which by the way is not actually a
Okay.
diagnosis.
Okay.
But again, it's just so like her gut was completely stripped because where is she getting nutrients from if she can barely eat any food? And the thing is that it's never about the food. So even with gluten and dairy, I don't think it's a food problem. I think there's definitely issues in the way that we process the food. Like with the gluten, I think it's the spraying that they're doing to the wheat grain. I don't think it's gluten as an actual food
Right.
because that's why people can go to Europe and they eat gluten with
I was
no.
just gonna say, yeah, because people can go to these other countries, and I'm from Canada, and I feel like I restricted, I guess, breads back in North America, whereas here when I came to Australia, I eat breads all the time because the reason why was because it upset my stomach back home and I felt
Mm.
bloated, whereas here I can. So that's an interesting thing there that they spray stuff on the breads.
Yeah, there's I think it's glycophosphate, which
Okay.
is actually illegal in a lot of countries. So it's
Mm,
crazy to think that we're consuming that.
yeah.
So again, I don't think it's a food problem because it's same as dairy, like it has a lot of things that we need for a healthy gut and a healthy body. But the issue comes with the way that your body will process those foods. And so if you just start stripping back those foods and avoiding them, the issue is still there. And so then you'll start reacting to foods that were normally like safe foods because the dysfunction just keeps getting worse and it's never actually treated. It was sort of like symptom management by just taking out what we think is
Right.
causing it.
Right. Okay. So, what is IBS then? Like, if it's not an actual diagnosis, what's IBS trying to encompass?
Good question.
Okay.
Yeah. This is one of my passion
Yeah.
topics because
Okay.
I was diagnosed with IBS, I think, 15 years ago.
I've been diagnosed with that too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's basically the diagnosis when they're like, we don't know what to do with you.
Yeah.
So here is just
Hmm.
a really blank. You can't do anything about it, but
Yeah.
here's a diagnosis,
Yeah.
right? So, oh, except low FODMAP
Yeah.
diet. That's what I
Okay.
was recommended to. Or they said just take painkillers because my pain was so bad that at times I was like on the floor curled up in a ball with like intense stabbing pain. And I look back and it all makes so much sense because I was going through one of the most stressful periods of my life. I was anxious all of the time. I was really underweight because I wasn't eating well. And so I look back and I'm like, well, of course my gut was like doing that. But yes, so IBS is basically like a collection of symptoms. So you can have IBS mixed, which is where your bowel motions will go basically from constipation to not just diarrhea, but sometimes it's just looser stools where they are like formed, but they're quite soft and they kind of come out quite easily. That's what we call like softer stools. They're not really formed and they do sort of come soon after eating. So that means that you're not having time to properly digest your food. So that's usually IBS mix. And then you have IBS just constipation because some people do just have lean towards constipation, or you can have IBS-D, which is diarrhea. So some people go between, some people just kind of stay in one, but normally what I find, and this is just in my own clinical experience, but there's normally two reasons for the IBS. It's either undiagnosed SIBO, which is what I was talking about, the small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, or it's anxiety, which causes hypersensitivity to the gut wall lining and basically eats away at the gut wall, causing leaky gut, causing inflammation, and yeah, that kind of causes all of the like really upset symptoms because it's almost like your stomach's just really irritated.
Yeah.
And when it's irritated, it's like, okay, well, I've eaten something that's upset it. Let me try and drop everything out of my stomach. And that can kind of manifest as those symptoms. But yeah, I can happily say that I don't have IBS anymore because I have just spent so much time and so much money on just like getting to the root cause. And what I thought, like that was the first time I ever saw a naturopath. So yeah, it was probably 15 years ago. And what I thought was going to be just like a really quick process ends up now me being a naturopath, and it's just led me down this journey of like uncovering all these other things that my body was communicating to me. Because at the end of the day, what I say to clients is like the body is not something to be conquered and it's not something that's an enemy. You don't want to look at your symptoms like, why is my body doing this to me? Like, it's kind of like the body's against you. You want to look at it like, what is the body trying to communicate with me? Because those symptoms are messengers and they're very powerful messengers. And I think what we get into the habit of too often with modern medicine is we medicate symptoms. And so it's just a suppression, but again, the issue is still there and it will come up in a different way. If not through that symptom, it'll come up another way. And then you just have to keep medicating to cover all of those symptoms.
Yeah, and I really like what you've mentioned numerous times is getting to that root cause because like you were saying is it goes for many things like even myself as a physio unless you get to the root cause like an injury or your sensitivity to a food is just going to kind of come on back. So that's an important topic and I know like stress and the brain and all of that's like such a huge topic, but can you speak a little bit on like how exactly stress and anxiety affects our guts and I know it's probably people need to get less stressed and that can fix a lot of things, but are there reasons why stress and anxieties and whatnot affect the gut?
Yeah, I think, and what I will mention is like everything that I mentioned might not be the only reasons, right? Because again, like you said, it's so broad, and I think so many things are under research, especially when it comes to the gut. But stress is a really tricky one because everyone experiences stress differently, and I think we're always going to have stress in our lives. So saying to someone, you need to get rid of the stress, and they're like, but the stress is my kids or my job, and you're like, okay, well, you're never going to be able to get rid of it. But we have to find what I like to think of as meaningful stress. So stress is always going to be there, but how can we have it so that it doesn't completely impact our lives? And how can we make sure that this stress is actually something we care about? So many people are so stressed about a job that they hate, and it's like, what's the point? So those things might be where we look at like, well, is there something else that would bring you more joy? So again, acknowledging that like, yes, stress we can't always get rid of because there's just always going to be things in our life that go wrong or things that happen. So I think actually I might have mentioned before that when we're in that fight or flight response, which a lot of people are in just day to day, it used to be that real like acute danger of, you've probably heard like being chased by a tiger. That's what we did back in the day. We'd get that fight or flight response, which is actually really important, by the way, because it's telling us there's danger and we need to flee really quickly. So it basically puts more blood flow into the really essential systems of the body, so like our muscles, because we're going to be running, and it's shutting off to conserve energy things we don't need, like the reproductive system, because we're not going to be making a baby when we're running from danger, and we're not going to be eating when we're running from danger. So that fight or flight response I think is so underrated to shutting off the digestive system. And when you're shutting off the digestive system, again, the body's not producing digestive enzymes, it's not producing stomach acid, what will break down and assimilate all the nutrients and send it to where it needs to go. So that's the main kind of factor that I find is when people are really like stressed and anxious and all of a sudden they're quite bloated and they need to go to the toilet or they get like nervous stomach. So again, I think that inflammation in the brain causes hypersensitivity of the gut wall lining, and that's what's basically sending out the messages of like something's upset the gut. So there's there's so many ways, and I think even like poor sleep, there's a huge impact with the gut. And also like the foods that we want to eat the next day, because when you don't sleep well, I find nothing really works super well. Like, you might have like your gut just doesn't feel right. You feel a bit off. You're really tired. You want to eat like quick, like, like calorie dense foods. Yeah. And then it just leads to just like over consuming caffeine, drinking caffeine on an empty stomach because you've gotten up late and you haven't had time to make breakfast.
Okay.
And coffee is very like acidic, so it's really irritating on the gut. So, I would say like a lot of patients come in and they know when they're telling me, they're like, yeah, I drank coffee on an empty stomach.
Yeah,
And it's
okay.
like, oh, you can't be doing that.
Yeah, yeah. What about like physical stress? Because you have, let's say, the fitness side of the things where a lot of people are putting their bodies through stress, and I think stress is stress sometimes. Is there any correlation between physical stress, like people that are training constantly throughout the week? Does that impact the gut at all?
I think it would depend what kind of training you're doing,
Okay.
and if you're overtraining versus under like eating,
Right. Okay.
that would definitely be an impact because again, if you're not eating enough protein, then you're not recovering properly, that's going to cause a lot more inflammation through the muscles, which is going to
Right.
affect your gut.
Mm.
Again, like I said, everything affects your gut.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it just really depends on like how hard you're going, how often, the duration, like how much rest time you're having.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say inflammation levels are definitely going to contribute to gut
Yeah.
health issues.
Okay. All right. So let's go into, because you mentioned it a couple of times. What's the difference between like prebiotic and probiotic? What I guess is a prebiotic and probiotic, and what's the difference between those two things?
Yeah, so a prebiotic is basically like fiber
Okay.
that will feed the beneficial bacteria. So this is found in so many foods, but artichokes, garlic, onion. Gosh, there's like so many,
Yeah,
depending
yeah.
on what kind of prebiotic,
Mm,
and different prebiotics will feed different parts of the gut microbiome as well. So that's why when we talk about diversity, I am someone who likes to eat the same thing all the time, and I'm trying
mm,
to get out of that pattern because,
mm.
what I encourage clients to do is when you do your grocery shopping, try and get 2 new vegetables that you don't normally eat. And then next week, you might swap those for 2 other vegetables that you haven't eaten in a while, or fruits, or whatever it is, so that the body is getting different fibers that is going to nourish different parts of the gut. And then the probiotics, that's basically the beneficial bacteria. So that's when you take like a tablet or a capsule that has basically like the live bacteria in there, and that will go into the gut and recolonize all those different species. So, sometimes you look on the back of like a probiotic bottle and it will say like the different species, and most
Yeah,
people don't really know what they're looking
yeah,
for.
yeah.
And that's because there's like, I think Cobiome, which is the company that I used to do functional testing with, they've identified, I think, like 22,000 different like species of beneficial bacteria.
Wow, okay.
And so then when we're testing, we're looking for like, what is that diversity?
Yeah.
I've never really seen someone with more than like 200 species.
Mm.
And that's okay. That's still quite diverse, but some people have as low as like 60. So,
Oh, wow, okay.
like to look at the landscape of like how much is out there versus how much we're actually getting is actually quite low.
Yeah.
So, yeah, basically we think of like pre is like the fuel. And what's going to feed the beneficial bacteria that's also there and encourage that to keep going and giving it like energy. And then probiotics is like basically recolonizing and putting back in
Right.
beneficial bacteria.
Right. So when people are taking, let's say, probiotics, or when people are trying to diversify their gut, because I think you touched on something interesting previously. You said that some people take the probiotics and feel worse after because they already have those microbiomes in their gut. And I've been that person. I've taken the probiotic and I felt it's after a week I've stopped taking it, and that's like $40 down the drain because I felt worse. So how do people diversify their guts? What are some common tips and tricks that you give people? Because I think, yeah, taking a pill is good, but are there other ways to diversify your gut?
Yeah, so I think, like I said, just try and eat like a
Yeah.
variety of like whole foods,
Hmm.
fruit and vegetables, even grains, things that you don't normally go for. Try and mix up, your usual day-to-day eating. And then, you can get like powders that you can add to like foods, and these are powders you can get from the supermarket. So like psyllium husk is a really common one. That's a prebiotic. What's another one? Slippery elm. Yeah, so just like adding different sources of food as well, because there are just some prebiotics, because if you can't tolerate a wide variety of food from the start, we're not going to say, okay, go out and eat 20 different foods, right? We really need to work with like, okay, let's start where we are. We'll just add in like a powder just so your body can start to produce some of its own beneficial bacteria. And then we can start to work on the diversity once your body can tolerate a lot of different foods as
Mm,
well.
yeah. What about the whole wellness and health space is big on like the kimchis and the kombuchas and that type of stuff. What about those type of foods?
So that is a tricky
Okay.
subject
Yeah.
because, again, I have fallen victim to like, I'm going to drink heaps of
Me
kombucha.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's going to make me feel better. And it actually didn't. I was actually finding I was more bloated after the kombucha. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. One is if you've got really low gut bacteria, then having such a high dose of like probiotic foods, it's almost like an adjustment period where there can be that sort of period where your body's just adjusting and it will naturally pass. But if it doesn't and you're continuing to drink that, well, one, kombucha is fizzy. So I think in a way it could potentially contribute to some of the bloating. And something that I really commonly see in clinic is histamine intolerance. So it's basically where the body naturally produces histamine from mast cells, which are part of our immune cells, and they're a neurotransmitter. So super important. But then if someone has, let's say, environmental allergies, or they're eating a lot of high histamine foods, like your nightshade vegetables, your tomatoes, potatoes, capsicum, spicy things. It's really high in alcohol, avocados, bananas, those kinds of things that you think are healthy. Sometimes it fills up the bucket too much. And this is really common in people who have like eczema or have been through like mold illness or are living in a house that's moldy. It's really common to have histamine intolerance, which is also something I do see quite often. And if you do have that, then you actually have to avoid those kind of like fermented foods because they can trigger your gut in a different way. So it's one of those things where, again, sometimes I'll see clients and they say, well, I don't get why I have these issues because I eat really healthy. And it's like, well, what's healthy? Because there's no such thing as a healthy diet. There's a diet that suits you, and that diet might not suit the next person, even if you have exactly the same conditions, if you're both relatively healthy. There's just no one size fits all. So I'm always really wary when people say I eat healthy. It's like, what does healthy mean? Because there's no blanket term. And so it's the same as like when those foods are hyped up and it's like, this is the fix for your gut issues, and it's just not the case.
Yeah. When people are taking a probiotic, do you often get them to take it, sporadically, or like, because I think a common thing, like you were saying, could be that they're just doing things and then, there's the turnaround period. But like, do people need to do it every second day, or is doing it daily enough?
It really depends on the strain of probiotic that you're using. Again, I am never prescribing probiotics unless I've seen someone's gut test,
Yeah.
because I just find, again, I don't want to like disturb anything. I'll usually do it by recolonizing through prebiotics. But with probiotics, if you're on the right strain and you're getting that like real discomfort at the start, then we might do like a pulse dosing, like a few days on, a few days off, or we start with like a lower dosage. Some people just do half a tablet, they open the capsule and sprinkle it on food. And that's a good way to kind of ease into it so that your body is not overwhelmed, because we have this thing in holistic medicine which is called a healing crisis, which is where when your body has been in dysfunction for so long and you take it out of dysfunction, it actually can almost go into like overwhelm and overdrive, and symptoms can get a lot worse before they get better as well. So that's why it's really important to always take supplements under the guidance of someone, because I think sometimes supplements get a bad name because people have taken the wrong ones, or they've self-prescribed, or they've just chosen any, or like what's worked for their friend, and then they have an adverse reaction because that hasn't been checked over. Like, well, what else are you taking? Are you, something came up really recently in the news about B6 toxicity, and I think they were taking a magnesium that had B6 in it, but the thing that they didn't mention, because all of a sudden they're demonizing magnesium supplements and B6, anything that's got B vitamins, but what they didn't mention was she had self-prescribed 3 other supplements and 2 of them also had B6 in them. So she was getting multiple sources of B6, and of course that's going to build up in your system, because also she's taking some of the tablets had synthetic forms of B6, which is what you find in kind of like chemist or store-bought supplements. So it's one of those things where it's like, it really should be done under guidance, and every food has the ability to be good or bad, same as all supplements as well.
Where do people people who don't have, as good of a microbiome because they've gone through years of antibiotics, or because they've gone through cancer treatment or whatnot, that's such a common thing where we don't realize like the effects of antibiotics. Like we think taking one thing, or going through like you were saying, the wormings type of stuff, like it kills everything really. So that can be quite a tricky thing, I think. But what are some easy things that you often recommend people do to I guess maybe maintain their gut while they're going through those treatments, or even like rebuild it after the treatments?
Going just back to the principles,
Right. Okay.
whole foods.
Yeah.
That those would be times where I'm looking at getting someone to do some gut testing. Of
Right.
course, finances are a limitation for a lot of people, but just getting, even if you can get in with like a well-versed gut practitioner, just so they can help you kind of maintain while you're going through that, because there are some instances where I will recommend, yes, you need to take the antibiotics. I don't think it has to be one or the other, but how can we support your gut alongside that? So usually we'll do maybe a probiotic that, there's a probiotic that actually doesn't colonize in the gut. So it's called S. boulardii, and it doesn't have its own colony. So that's usually a pretty safe one to take if you've taken antibiotics, or if you're going traveling to somewhere like Bali or India, to avoid getting gastro or, barley belly.
Yeah.
And that one's usually a pretty safe one to start with because, again, it's not going to over colonize anything. So if you are taking antibiotics, that's something you could do alongside of it. Again, adding in lots of prebiotic powders while you're going through that journey because the gut is going to help you with any treatment that you do, whether that's gut related, whether it's immune system related, whatever treatment you're going through currently, if it's through the medical system, working on the gut is never going to be a waste of time. So, yeah.
Yeah. And how can people, I guess, like people that are, let's say, going back to the fitness space, people that are going through like these high amounts of stress and, let's say, overtraining because that's what they have to do for their sport. What are some tips that you recommend people do to, I guess, work on their gut and maintain a good gut health?
Probably, so like, there's ways to do, let's say, like the gels that people take when they're running.
Yeah.
There are ways that you can get those fast carbs without it having to be from gels so that you're not having those really high sugar impacts. So again, I think there's certain naturopaths that work as like sports nutritionists, and I think that would be really helpful if you are an athlete and you're struggling with gut issues, because again, they're going to be well versed about like, well, you still need this amount of fuel, but how can you get it from a better source rather than focusing on like the packaged sources. So I think that is really important, and athletes need to put a lot more emphasis on like recovery and making sure that they're refueling, but again, with like whole foods as much as possible. I know it's really hard because my partner, he is like in doing so much exercise and he's eating such a huge volume of food, but it can be really hard when you finish exercising and you're so hungry. You just want to eat something like straight away. You don't have time to go home and like, make a good meal. So that's really important to have those foundations down of like having good food on hand, so that you don't just go for like those quick prepackaged high sugar, high energy foods.
Yeah. What are some foods or some easy foods that people can have on hand? What are your go-to recommendations?
Dates,
Okay.
that's the best one.
Yeah?
Yeah, because
Okay.
they're high sugar, and they will deliver that fuel
Yeah.
fairly quickly
Yeah.
as well. So yeah, dates with peanut butter
Okay.
is something you can have on hand
Yeah.
always.
Yeah. What
Peanut
about
peanut butter.
what about snacks? So people that are, workers or people that like to snack a lot, what are some easy snacks that people can do to be, I guess, okay on the gut, I guess?
So of course we go to like whole foods, but acknowledging that not everyone is going to have access to that depending on what your job is, if you don't have a fridge or, whatever it is. So something as simple as like boiled eggs, that's just my go-to because I'm like, they're so easy. It's clean, it's cheap. But when we go to, and of course, like you've got fruit, nuts, those kinds of things. Like I always have a little container with some nuts on hand in my bag. And then there's, I think I mentioned before, like protein bars can be a bit of an issue, but that doesn't mean all of them are bad. There's actually some really good brands that have come out recently, like Chief Collagen is amazing. So instead of protein powder, it uses collagen powder and still quite high in protein, really good ingredients. It's more that sometimes these good snacks you don't always find at the supermarket. So online health food stores, that's my like go-to because they have such a good range. So there are some good protein bars. Again, you're looking for something that's like low in sugar, low in ingredients, and more like whole food ingredients. Recently, I used to be obsessed with Twiggy sticks as a
Yeah.
child,
Uh-huh.
and obviously I don't eat them anymore, knowing that how bad they are for you. But like beef jerky has recently just come back into fashion because it's not that it was ever bad for you. It's in the way that the preservatives that they use on conventionally bought beef jerky, that was the main issue. But there's really good, like Chief Collagen does like beef jerky. There's a brand called Cooey, and they basically look like Twiggy sticks, but they're basically just like a meat stick. It's like grass-fed beef and salt. So clean. There's like 7 grams of protein in it. So little things like that. Again, dates are really good if there's going to be a period where you might not be able to eat for a long period of time. So having that like soon after a meal, if it's going to be a long time before your next meal, if you've got like a work meeting or something like that, that will keep you like quite fulfilled. And then protein smoothies, like I'd say to people, like, make it in the morning, take it to work with you, and just keep it for when you're getting that afternoon slump and you want something like a little bit sweet. That's when you need protein the most. So that's when we want to avoid going for like the high sugar foods where we might like, dip into like the chocolate bowl at work or something like that. And a really good tip that I give people is to like prep your smoothies like a week ahead. So, get like 5 jars, put all the dry ingredients of your smoothies in the jars, and then every morning all you have to do is throw that in, add the wet ingredients, and then it's like the quickest smoothie ever.
Good way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Because people like it quick and easy. So that's a very
Yeah.
good tip there. What are some myths about the gut that you often experience and you often have to try and debunk with your clients? What are some maybe 2 or 3 myths that are around there? Take a think, because that's a huge one, I think.
Yeah, you've thrown me that one. Okay, so first one would probably be, I think I touched on this at the start, is that the gut works in isolation. So that when you have a gut issue, it's purely that. And that if you don't have any overt symptoms of a gut issue, then your gut must be functioning fine. Right. Second, I don't know if this is specific to gut, but it's like dairy and gluten are bad for you kind of thing. That rhetoric of like, I don't want to go to a naturopath because they'll tell me to cut out gluten or dairy, or people who just cut it out themselves because they're like, I have a bit of a gut issue.
Yeah, that all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think like I like the dairy and gluten one, because I think you hear that so many times, like people swapping out their, let's say, coffee and their milk with almond milk and this and that. And it's interesting because, again, I haven't looked at the research on things like that, but you hit something key in the beginning, near the beginning. You're saying that, like, carbs, for example, they spray things, and that's why it affects kind of people's guts sometimes in different areas of the world. But people are having like these almond milks and all of that type of stuff, but like almonds also get sprayed, so like does that affect the gut? You know what I mean? So like I think we don't think about little things like that, and it's quite interesting because the way that food is processed these days is so different than it was back like 20 years ago even. Let's say you have like a vegetarian or a vegan coming to see you. What are things that they need to watch for when it comes to like going to the grocery store? Because I think like I was a vegan for 14 years. I'm not anymore, but 14 years ago when I first started being a vegan, there was nothing on the shelves basically. I had to eat tofu and like, create my own recipes, whereas now you go through the shelves and I feel like there's 20 things in each aisle that are vegan. So what are kind of things that people need to watch for when they're going through the aisles when you are vegan or vegetarian?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Because I will always say no fake meat.
Okay.
So there's not one bit of, like, I guess I'll just call it fake meat just for the ease of it, because it looks like meat, it's supposed to resemble meat, but again, it's the chemical structure. Like, you look at the ingredients, a lot of people don't. A lot of people think, oh, perfect, this looks like chicken strips, and it's vegetarian. And
they see the vegan label, and I think people think, oh, that's healthy.
Absolutely, yes. And I've fallen victim to that too. I think I was on and off vegetarian for maybe like 8 years or so, but I always struggled, and I think that's why I went on and off, because if you're vegetarian or vegan, you have to do your diet super well. You don't have, I guess, the luxury of convenience like other people do if you're going to do it well. And to be honest, there's not many patients, and I don't know if that's just because, of course, I'm seeing people when they're not well, but I've never really seen anyone do a vegan diet well, because you do have to just, if we're focusing on whole foods, then the amount of protein that you're going to need to eat, the volume is so big. And one thing I find with vegans or vegetarians is sometimes they're low in B12, so they already struggle with their appetite.
Right.
So eating a high volume of foods just to get enough nutrients in can actually be quite hard for them. So I would say, again, going back to the whole foods theory of like avoiding anything that's packaged and supposed to look like meat, and focus on, like tofu, but buying organic tofu. beans, legumes, nuts, seeds, all of those kinds of things. And because obviously with protein, like meat is a complete protein, whereas with vegetarian proteins, they're incomplete, where they're missing a lot of the, like, one or two amino acids from each source. So you kind of really have to pair them well together to be getting a complete source. And vegetarian protein is 25% less digestible
Right.
than meat. So
Okay.
again, you almost have to eat that 25% more to be getting the same amount.
Yeah.
So I just think if you're going to be vegetarian, and of course everyone has different reasons for wanting to do that, or vegan, then you do have to really put a lot of effort into your diet and make sure that everything's like balanced, and you've always kind of got options on hand. Like meal prep will be a huge thing for that, like making big batches of food and freezing some so that you're never caught out too much with that convenience. And of course there's going to be times you go out to eat, that's fine, but if you're eating a lot of that processed foods all of the time, then that is where a lot of the gut issues happen, because you look at some of the ingredients and like I don't even know if some of them are actually food.
Yeah, all man-made stuff. It's a bit scary,
Yeah.
isn't it, to think really that
Yeah.
it looks like food and it's made to imitate food, but is it really food? Yeah.
Yeah.
What are some common, like, I guess, nutrients that this goes to everybody now? Are there any nutrients that you find people are deficient in usually in Australia?
Iron is probably the most common, but I also don't know if that's because it's the most commonly tested,
Okay.
that's why it's low
Right.
all of the time. But that takes me into a good topic, I guess, of like low iron and the gut, because a lot of people don't realize that the two are linked. So having consistently really low iron is one of the red flag markers for celiac disease, which is gluten allergy. Because what happens is when you're consuming foods that trigger your gut all the time, whether that's an allergy or whether it's more of like an intolerance, your gut is not going to absorb food properly, and especially iron being the most important because it has so many functions in the body. We don't store iron as we need to, and we don't metabolize it as we need to. So I'm usually looking for that link. Again, if someone's coming in, they've got low iron on and off for years, they supplement, it gets better, they stop supplementing, it goes down again. That's a red flag for like, I think there's some gut issues happening here. Not always celiac, but we look at like, okay, well, if it's not, let's say you have low iron, we're looking at, do you have really heavy periods? Because that can be a reason. We look at, are you vegetarian or vegan? Because of course that's another reason. If those two are ruled out, there should be no other reason that you're having low iron. And I think for women it's really hard because, I've been subject to years of low iron and been told, well, it's normal because you bleed every month. And I just don't think that's the case, because why are we so deficient in something that is so like common in the foods that I'm eating? I was eating red meat at the time. I was eating quite a bit of red meat actually. So we sort of need to look at like what is stopping the absorption there. So I would probably say maybe zinc and iron are probably the two.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any like brands that you work with or that you often recommend when it comes to people taking supplements or taking probiotics, or are there in your experience ones that are better than the others?
I pretty much only use practitioner only prescribed supplements. So
Okay.
they need to be prescribed by, a health practitioner, purely for the reason that the forms of the vitamins or the herbs or the nutrients that are in them are vastly different, and that's why they're more expensive.
Right.
So sometimes people think that like naturopaths must just like mark up, or like any practitioner, right, like marks up the supplement, but it's like we're just charging the normal retail, and the reason that it's more expensive is because it's better quality. It's usually a higher dose, but with higher dose comes more caution. Like you do really like I guess self-prescribing is something I would never really recommend for people, because again, I have been victim to this. I would be like, oh, like B vitamins, it's for low energy. I have low energy. Let me just start taking that. And then after a few weeks, I'm like, I don't think that was helping. So it's like you can't just use like a symptom because basically that's like green pharmacy, right? It's like we're almost doing the same thing if we get into that habit of what modern medicine is doing, is like giving a supplement or a herb for a symptom, which is low energy, right? So it's like you can't just take an iron tablet if you're feeling low and fatigued, because long-term iron supplements have actually shown to be really bad for your liver. So that's why, again, we're looking at, well, what's the cause of low iron? Because you cannot keep taking like an iron supplement for the rest of your life. We really need to figure out what's going on. So I would say a lot of practitioner-only brands, purely because the quality is just so much better.
Superior. So
Yeah.
for these people that have these issues, how long are they in for? Like, how long does these testing processes take? Is it like a week's thing? Is it a month's thing? Or is it a pretty quick thing?
Oh, that is
Yeah.
there's like no answer to that
No,
question
okay.
really. Yeah,
It depends.
it's so depends.
Yeah,
It depends
okay.
if it's purely just a really simple cut issue of like this is the root cause,
Right,
we
okay.
can really easily get to that. Or if it's something where when we start testing, we start uncovering more things. And sometimes that can be quite a process, right? For some people, they come 3 months is probably like a minimum of what I'd recommend of like committing your time.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean it's 100% of your time, but it's like this is probably how long it's going to take minimum.
Yeah.
And a general rule of thumb that we use is how many years you've had the issue for converted to months. So if you've been dealing with something for 5 years, about 5 months would be like the minimum amount of time that you're in for. And then in saying that, sometimes I've uncovered like, we start working on like gut issues, but the gut issues were just a symptom of like an autoimmune condition. And of course, autoimmune conditions are so much more chronic. So that really takes time.
Yeah.
Sometimes I've been with patients for 2 years and I'm still sort of seeing them, not as regularly, but we're still monitoring. We're making sure that they're staying in remission and they're not going to go back into a flare. So yeah. No
Yeah.
clear-cut
No,
answer.
but yeah, I guess it is, like you were saying, it is individualized, and that's probably a good thing, really, that everybody's taking the time to get their answer, really. Let's maybe finish it off with just kind of talking a little bit about like what common, or is there any relationship between like people's hormones and the gut, and that's the whole side of things.
Yeah. So there's a really, I guess, debilitating condition called PMDD. And people think it's maybe just like a worse version of PMS, which it can be, but it lasts for longer and it's more chronic to the point where some people have suicidal thoughts or they can get like so down and they feel like a completely different person in that kind of week to 10 days leading up to their period. And that has shown to be a serotonin deficiency. And if we think back to the start, I think I mentioned most of our serotonin is synthesized in the gut.
Right.
So we're looking at like mood disorders that are impacted by our hormones, which are affected by the gut. So that's just like one of the ways in which we see. But then we've got things like polycystic ovarian syndrome, which we used to think was just a reproductive issue, but more recently it's kind of like a whole system issue. And for a lot of people, it's like a metabolic issue. So we see things like insulin resistance leading to kind of pre-diabetes. That's really common with people that have PCOS. And we look at the gut again. There's certain beneficial bacteria that are responsible for insulin signaling. Right. So if we don't have enough of those, or we have too high of certain levels that contribute to like high BMI or obesity or things like that, again, that's all like hormonal. It's not driven by hormones, but it affects our hormones because then when you have high insulin, that makes you have really long cycles and you can have really heavy bleeding. So yeah, that's always something that I'm looking for in the gut when there's hormone issues.
Do you notice, like, do women have more issues with their gut compared to men, or does it not work like that usually?
That's interesting. And I'm going to answer this again just based on maybe not what's everyone's experience, but from my clinical experience, what I've realized is men come to me when it's the real end stage, when they have been dealing with things for so long. But I think there has been potentially a bit more culture with men of we don't speak up until it's really bad. And, this has actually happened in a couple of male patients that I've had who are having what they think are extreme gut issues, like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea that goes on and on. They can't work. They're really anxious. And then we do a gut test and there's so much going on. But also because of this, they've had so much depression and anxiety, which is making the gut issues even worse. So I think, if anything, I see more women, but I also think it's because women are potentially a bit more in tune with, and they have that ability to, I guess, speak up when something's not like feeling right for them. Whereas I think men sometimes we're in this culture where it's like, oh, just push through, it'll get better. What are you complaining for? Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's almost like the male patients I've seen, the
Mm.
gut issues are quite severe, but it is probably because they've left them a little bit
Yeah,
longer than.
yeah. I guess we all have issues or the potential to have issues, but like you were saying, it's the culture really that differentiates between asking for help and not.
Mm.
Where can people find you and where can people work with you, Stephanie? So plug in your Instagram and whatever else you want. Where can people kind of work with you and find you?
Yeah, so I do in-person and online
Mhm.
naturopath consults. So my in-person clinic is in Marlston on Richmond Road in Adelaide. So my website is eclipsewellness.com.au, and then you can find me on Instagram, which is eclipse_naturopathy.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. That will all be in the show notes, everybody. So definitely you can follow Stephanie there and reach out if you have any questions. But that was awesome. Very informative. I think people will get a lot out of today's episode because, like I was saying, I think everybody probably has had an issue with their gut, whether they realized it or not. So it's such a common topic. But thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Alrighty, everybody. That is it for today's episode. I want to thank Stephanie once again for coming on the podcast. This was very informative, and be sure to check out the show notes, everybody. You can follow Stephanie's Instagram page. All of the links are in the show notes. Thank you all for listening. If you can all on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening, hit that 5-star review button. It really helps out the podcast and it only takes a couple of seconds. I will talk to you all in the next episode.